I also want to thank our webinar co-hosts, Labor for Palestine and Independent Jewish Voices, and I want to thank our amazing panelists for joining us this evening to present their perspective and expertise. Also, a big thank you to the staff and the tech support team working on the back end, folks from PSAC NCR and Labor for Palestine, the interpreters and technicians from ELC, and of course, I'd like to thank all of you attending this webinar for joining us tonight for this important discussion. We'll begin our event tonight with an acknowledgement that all of us gathered here are on Indigenous land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Wherever you're located in Canada, it's important to acknowledge the territory on which you work, live, and organize. I myself live in Ottawa, which is located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And share a few words on that. When we look at our own history of colonial oppression, we know that the residential school system and the attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples here in Canada was a grave injustice. And we rightfully strongly condemn these atrocities in our past, just as we must condemn them in the present and condemn any government or state carrying out policies of genocide. Otherwise, our commitments of truth and reconciliation are hypocritical and ring hollow. We've learned from the teachings of Indigenous peoples, teachings that we must hear and heed, that the path to reconciliation and the path to peace begins with truth. And the truth is that in the last 3 weeks, over 8,000 Palestinians have lost their lives due to the widespread bombing by the government of Israel. It's estimated that over 3,000 of these deaths have been children. And tragically, we know that with the escalation of military action against civilians, this number will keep rising. It's also truth that nearly 1,500 Israelis were killed October 7th. And every loss of human life is tragic, and we mourn all of these deaths. This is an international tragedy and a humanitarian crisis. And as a global leader, Canada must live up to our humanitarian values that we aspire to and be an active participant in calling for a ceasefire, an end to the occupation and blockade, the release of all hostages and political prisoners, and access to humanitarian aid in Gaza. Many have asked why PSAC NCR is hosting this webinar. I've spent the better part of the last 2 days answering a lot of your emails and engaging in discussion with members. My hope is that that question will be answered through the presentations we're all about to hear. It is my firm belief that part of the role of the union is to engage on political issues, both locally and globally. And ideally, to foster dialogue on issues so that we move from division towards empathy and understanding. Historically, unions have undertaken projects of international solidarity because we know that the people on the ground who are caught in these conflict zones, the workers, the families, the people on either side of any conflict are the innocent victims in all of this. This is true of all the innocent people killed, injured, and displaced. That's why this webinar hopes to talk about what can be done to bring about a just and lasting peace. Politically, through the democratic decision-making process of our union, PSAC's position on this has been informed by our membership. You can read the statements published by PSAC online. I would also add that in 2012, a resolution supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS movement, was passed, which also called on Canada to take action on Israel's attacks on Gaza, as well as the evictions of Palestinians from Jerusalem. So this was a resolution in 2012. More recently, in 2021, members of the PSAC National Capital Region Convention passed an emergency resolution to express our solidarity with the Palestinian people and to call for an end to evictions and the suppression of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And that the union demands that Canada suspends arms sales to Israel until it complies with international law. The reason I bring this up, and I want to recognize that some of the PSAC activists who were key in passing the 2021 resolution in solidarity with the Palestinians are present tonight. I want to thank them for their continued activism on these issues and thank all human rights and equity activists within our union. And the reason I bring up these resolutions is to point out that our union has been in dialogue on these issues for over a decade. And these resolutions and initiatives, like this webinar, are an expression of the will of the membership and also how we move this work forward to foster better understanding and empathy. Our union has also signed on to a diverse coalition of faith, community, humanitarian, and labor organizations to call for a ceasefire, an end to the blockade and occupation of Gaza, the release of all hostages and political prisoners, and the opening of a corridor for humanitarian aid. You can read the statement at ceasefirenow.ca. I believe part of our role in all this is to do what we can to pressure to Canadian decision makers to prevent a genocide from happening and to encourage Canada to take an active role in fostering a just and lasting peace for Palestinians and Israelis alike. But that peace process cannot ignore systemic and root causes, and this webinar has the intention of providing more information and education on this. Countering hate, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of hate is a priority for me personally, as well as for PSAC NCR and for PSAC. I recognize that many of our members, just as many Canadians, have been deeply troubled by this humanitarian crisis and are living under extreme stress, anxiety, grief, and fear in their communities and in their workplaces. I empathize with how you're feeling. My heart goes out to all those who are suffering and to all the innocent victims in this conflict. In recognition of this, before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to join me in a moment of silence for all the lives lost in the recent weeks. Thank you, everyone. C'est tout le monde. We're now going to move to our panel, and it is my privilege to introduce our panel. Tonight, we are joined by labor lawyer Wassim Garzouzi, Labor for Palestine organizer and PSAC national negotiator Hassan Husseini, author and activist Judy Rebick, representing Independent Jewish Voices, and Palestinian scholar, academic, and trade unionist Rana Daher. We'll start by hearing from each panelist, who will speak for roughly 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will proceed to the Q&A with our remaining time. I'll start by introducing Rena, who is joining us from Palestine. Before I read her bio, let me start by thanking you for joining us, Rena, recognizing that this is not only is this an extremely late late hour in Palestine with the time difference, but that also you're, of course, living in the center of all this. So I hope you're staying safe, and our thoughts are with you and everyone else living through this crisis. Rana Daher is an associate professor of history and contemporary Arab studies and director of the museum at Birzeit University in Palestine. Her research interests include the history of historiography of colonialism, nationalism, and cultures of resistance. She has 2 books in progress, one that advances an indigenous understanding of time, space, and memory in Palestine, and another book on constructing a history of resistance in Palestine. She's a member of her local union, EZU Union of Professors and Employees. We're very grateful to have you joining us tonight, Rana, and I will now pass the mic over to you.
Thank you. Good evening and good morning. It's 1 in the evening here, so all's quiet on the West Bank front right now. I want to thank you for this invitation and for that beautiful presentation, Alex, and for the space to be able to speak about what's happening. I'm currently, as Alex just described, speaking to you from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, in the midst of what must look to you like a war, or more specifically, a genocidal invasion on Palestine and the Palestinian people. Excuse me. I was asked to speak to 2 specific things today. The present in Palestine is a part of a much longer historical framework and context of Palestine, including a basic presentation of the colonial, settler colonial, and imperial context of Palestine. Rather than the past, though, I want to begin with the present, because the past is actually always present, and our present is atrocious beyond my humble abilities to put words to the horror. Let me begin today with what the eminent historian Shireen Saikali described in May of this year upon the 75th commemoration of the Nakba War as an inventory of catastrophes, of which the ongoing Palestinian Nakba is but one part. And now, as seen on the global stage, is perhaps an epicenter for a global struggle against oppression. The irony of counting in the present is that the level of sheer force and violence cannot be represented in the numbers. Even if I tell you, for example, that 6 one-ton bombs were dropped by the Israeli military onto a densely populated neighborhood in the Jabalia refugee camp yesterday, the largest refugee camp in all of historic Palestine, you, like myself, probably can't quite fathom what 6 one-ton bombs do. I simply cannot. But what I hope to bring to you today was not just the tons of bombs on that camp, but the very existence of the camp, a camp of refugees, is our ongoing Nakba. As horrible as this all is, though much still lays under the rubbles of those bombs, we now know that at least 400 people were murdered by those bombs yesterday. That was yesterday. That was 1 hour of 26 days of endless bombing of the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli military bombed Jabalia again today and continues to bomb through the night. This is an ongoing Nakba. This did not begin in 2023, but the past is present and ongoing, and this is a genocidal war. The truth is, what's happening now in Palestine is a genocide. In fact, Raz Siegel, a world-renowned scholar in genocide studies, called what's happening simply, quote unquote, a textbook case of genocide. The director of the Office of High Commission of Human Rights, Craig Mukhabbir, has resigned from the UN for the UN in failing in its duty to prevent what he categorizes as genocide of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, citing US, UK, and much of Europe as being wholly complicit in the assault. He wrote in his resignation letter, quote, "We are seeing a genocide unfolding before our very eyes, and the organization we serve appears powerless to stop it." Moreover, Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur, along with so many others, are themselves screaming about the threat of genocide and our dire human need to stop it. On October 24th, Richard Fox stated that the West's refusal to call for a ceasefire, including Canada's refusal, is a green light to Israel's ethnic cleansing, which we are seeing unfold before our very eyes. As of the end of October, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, 8,525 Palestinian civilians have been killed in Gaza, of whom 67% are children and women. More than 3,000 children have been murdered. And according to Save the Children, 1 child every 10 minutes is killed in Gaza. Take that in. 1 child every 10 minutes. As dire as the situation is right now, I want to emphasize that history does not begin here in October. In fact, out of respect for you and my friends who invited me here, I will try my best to give a general historical overview, but I can't promise that I'll stay general because I am a history professor, so we tend to go into detail. But I want, in order to sort of alleviate myself from that sense of responsibility, encourage everyone here to seek out this knowledge. So many of us, for 3 generations, have been working towards documenting our anti-colonial struggle, but also as a part of what Alex referred to earlier in terms of Indigenous recognition, our demands to be heard, not to be silenced under the obfuscation of the language of the ruling classes whose wealth and power depend on our servitude, erasure, and silence. Your union, along with the rubric of all of the unions under Labor for Palestine, as well as Faculty for Palestine in Canada, are tremendous resources. Please use them. We can no longer say that we did not know, nor can we afford to be silent anymore. What's happening now is an intensification of a century of war against Palestine, as Rashid Khalidi describes in his most recent book. More specifically, the history of Palestine and Palestinians is simply bigger than colonialism. But we should note that colonialism, direct intervention, invasion, and occupation began in the First World War, often referred to as the Imperial War. Gaza, the same entry from the sea to the land of Palestine that you see today, was at that time in the First World War a bloody battlefield in a war that remains bloody today. In the wake of that First World War, the geographic region, often referred to as the Middle East, was divided amongst imperial powers. The British named their military occupation and later civilian colonial rule the Mandate of Palestine in 1922. More than 2 decades followed of colonial mandate rule, and that lasted until 1947. It should be noted that during this era, the colonial mandate era, the British were the colonial governing power who did not recognize the national rights of Palestinians, the native people of this land, and used their mechanisms of power to recognize and foster the settler colonial movement of Zionism, whereby the government facilitated and grounded settlement in Palestine. Denial of Palestinian self-determination also has a long history. This facilitation by the British is not obscure to you in this audience, nor is it a theoretical obfuscation to Canada as a settler colonial state. While our struggles are local in so many ways, we also know how our connections are global, as is our struggle. In 1947, and in the aftermath of the Second World War, the British government officially turned over their mandate of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations. On the 29th of November of 1947, the first of many attempts towards partitioning Palestine in an internationally sanctioned arena began. Remember, this is not a very long history up until that point. And in 1947, Palestinians were offered and refused, the first of many colonial compromises that would continue and have until this day. The refusal is based on Palestinian self-determination. The British at the time claimed that this small piece of land was an unresolvable conflict. Note this colonial language. It was unresolvable and untenable. The British failed to mention at the time, as empires tend to do, that what actually made the situation untenable were their colonial policies. Note as well, it was and remains untenable because of the outright denial of Palestinian national rights and our refusal to accept that denial. This sparked the Nakba War, and in the subsequent year led to the declaration of the Israeli state, and by 1949, violently rendered nearly 3/4 of the Palestinian people refugees. This is where you can begin to see the violent implementation of the fragmentation of the map of Palestine. Herein, you can see this new intervention, the Gaza Strip, that small strip of land that you see now under fire, or perhaps some choose not to see, was itself an imperial invention. Between 1947 and 1967, the Gaza Strip fell under the rule of the Egyptian government, and the West Bank, where I am, fell under the rule of the Jordanian state. In 1967 and after the June War, the war resulted in the full occupation of historic Palestine. Both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights thereafter have been referred to and treated as occupied territories. This military occupation, while going through different looks over the years, lasts as it did in 1967 until today. That is 56 years of internationally recognized military occupation. Through this framework, you can now frame the context of the war on Gaza. You see martial law in the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem. The Gaza Strip is, as I'm sure you know, the most densely populated sliver of land in the world. More than 3/4 of the people that live in Gaza are refugees. Between 1967 and now, this small strip of land and the people in it have endured ever-growing intensification of a century-long war on all of Palestine. More recently, the people of Gaza have been subjected to a siege quite rare in the history of mankind. 16 years of a siege that led many thinkers to declare Gaza as the largest open-air prison in the world. Now, perhaps some may want to call it the largest cemetery in the world. I hope not. So I'd like to remind you of the Jabalia bombing. and all the bombings in Gaza, the unprecedented scale of bombardment on a people. The killing of civilians you are witnessing now is the killing of 3 generations of people who have been denied their right of return, refused their homes, dispossessed, and displaced. This keeps happening, but I want to say this time, it is a level of unprecedented violence in both Gaza and the West Bank. 2023 has been the bloodiest year over the last several decades of this occupation. Now, over the course of October, the Israelis have cut off electricity and water to the Gaza Strip since the first week of this most recent iteration of the war on Palestine. Over 1 million people in Gaza are now newly displaced. Nearly 9,000 have been killed, and again, more than 3,000 of them are children. It feels like they're trying to kill the 4th generation. In the West Bank, cities have been cut off from each other. And there are nightly raids, often daily raids, of the Israeli army throughout the West Bank. And now we have more than 10,000 political prisoners in Israeli jails. We can't even count because the nightly raids have led to such high numbers of political imprisonment. As you can see, with all due respect, this is not a conflict, but rather this is a century-long struggle against colonialism. It is also a century-long struggle against oppression. As early as 1921, protests broke out in the seaports of Jaffa, where laborers protested against the British military's infrastructure on that port city. It is not only the Nakba that's ongoing, but our protests are also ongoing. In 1936, a general strike was called for, led by workers and teachers, and is to this day the longest lasting strike in modern history. This strike is what framed one of the most important moments in Palestinian history over the last century, in the form of the Great Revolt. You can read about this in a short but yet still very relevant study by Ghassan Kanafani. On the other end of the political economy spectrum, you can also read how intertwined the histories of capitalism are with the histories of colonialism in Palestine. I encourage you to read Shireen Saikali's Men of Capital to see how history does not actually repeat itself, as some claim, but is a structural formation. Palestine is an issue for Palestinians, obviously, but it is also central to understand how capitalism has changed over the decades to be the oppressive force that it continues to be. This is part and parcel of imperial power, and why Palestine, or more specifically Israel now, represents what it represents in terms of ongoing imperial conquest in our world. Through our protests, we build collectivity. It is a hope that through this solidarity, we can together build the world that we want to live in. In 1936, we also witnessed in 1987 a major uprising in Palestine, often referred to as the First Intifada. This too was led by students and workers and began in December of 1987. The First Intifada was a result of a great deal of organizing, often led by trade unionists. Not ironically, this was also a continuation of the history of solidarity with Palestine. Throughout the century, there have been international solidarity calls led over time by good folks organizing in unions like yours and mine. What we are doing in this room is part of that ongoing solidarity amongst workers of the world with Palestine and with ourselves. I think I might have taken a bit more time than I was allotted, and I apologize for that. I know others on this panel will speak to the present, perhaps more eloquently or certainly more calmly than I did. But I want us to know that we cannot be silent in this genocide. So I'm just going to take my final moment to speak to what Alex referred to earlier, which is BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Campaign. Within this, and for all academics here and beyond, we also have PACB, the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. These calls came from civil society here in Palestine and specifically came out to build in the early 21st century, to build, or I would say, continue building an international movement to end support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians and to pressure Israel to comply with international law. Alex mentioned that you have signed on to this call, but I would like just to reiterate to everybody in this room that this has never been more urgent than now. This is how we build and nurture the bonds of our humanity. This is how we can build a world that we actually want to live in. And as Antonio Gramsci famously said, the old world is dying, the new world is struggling to be born, and this is the time of monsters. We are in this together, and together we have to prevail. Demand an end, immediate ceasefire to this genocide. It is a testament, as many of the protesters throughout the world have chanted, that we cannot accept to live in a world where protesting the bombing of children is in any way a complicated demand. It is not. Demand that our voices not be silent. Demand the end of the refusal of Palestinian self-determination. Demand that we live in a world that we deserve to live in together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rena. I'm not sure I quite have the words, but thank you for your strength and your grace and the emotional labor. I know it's difficult to be living what you're living through, and then to be talking about it with us. And so I think I can speak on behalf of all the organizers. We're incredibly grateful that you took the time to join us tonight, and thank you for providing both an educational and deeply moving and emotional presentation, and also for explaining the historical context. Know that many of us here in Canada feel helpless, feel that ashamed at our government's blind eye. But we are organizing, and we will keep organizing, and we will keep taking to the streets and demanding action from the government of Canada to work towards a peaceful resolution and a ceasefire. Thank you so much, Rena. Next, we'll move to our next panelist. I'm going to introduce someone who is going to be familiar to a lot of PSAC members, and of course to many across our labor movement, Hassan Husseini. Hassan is a national negotiator with the Public Service Alliance of Canada, where he represents PSAC members during contract negotiations under federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions. Hassan joins us tonight as an organizer with Labor for Palestine Canada. He has occupied a number of union roles, including president of CUPE Local 4600 at Carleton University, president of the Ottawa CUPE District Council, organizer and chief shop steward with Unifor Local 2025 of PSAC staffers. Hassan has also represented workers in his capacity as a national representative with the Canadian Labour Congress, the political communications officer and regional representative at PSAC. And in 2014, he ran for the presidency of the Canadian Labour Congress on a program of renewed labour militancy and activism. I'll also add that Hassan was one of the key organizers to counter the 2022 convoy occupation, and was instrumental in the formation of a diverse coalition of labour and community allies that worked to support the community and workers throughout the occupation, and to counter the messages of hate, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-2S LGBTQ plus hate, and anti-migrant hate present in the convoy. Hassan, my friend, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. Greetings, everyone. I'm usually in Ottawa, but I'm coming to you tonight from Halifax, which is the ancestral and traditional land of the Mi'kmaq people. I'd like to first, of course, extend my thanks to Alex Silas at the PSAC and our partners in Independent Jewish Voices for working together to organize this important webinar. I'm speaking today, of course, as a labor activist, as an organizer with Labor for Palestine. My remarks this evening represent my personal views and those of my organization, Labor for Palestine, and not necessarily my employer, the PSAC. More importantly, although I have formally studied Middle East politics and the Palestine-Israel issue during my graduate studies, I'm speaking to you this evening as an activist, first and foremost, and someone with a lived experience under Israeli occupation in South Lebanon in the early 1980s. And I certainly bear witness during that time to the brutality of the Israeli occupation. This evening, I'd like to tackle 3 points briefly, although I may still go over the time a little bit. One is Canada's position on the question of Palestine today and in historical context. Two, a brief introduction to what Labor for Palestine is and what we're doing in very general terms, and why solidarity with Palestinian human rights and liberation struggle is a workers and union issue. And number three, I want to give some ideas about how your union and yourself as a labor activist can work to stop the genocide unfolding in Gaza today, and what you can do tomorrow to support the Palestinian people and workers. Let's start by busting the myth about Canada's neutrality on the international stage. Popular myth, of course, notwithstanding, and those are: Canada is a country of peacekeeping. It's an independent and sovereign in our foreign policy. It cares for the and fights for human rights, and so on and so forth. Notwithstanding these myths, Canada has supported the Zionist colonization of Palestine from the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the onset of the Nakba that Rana spoke about, that I will not elaborate on. During the 1947, when the United Kingdom abandoned or wanted to abandon its control over historic Palestine, the United Nations established a committee, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. A number of countries, of course, were and sat and sent representatives to this committee. Judge Ivan C. Rand, yes, the same infamous Rand of the Rand formula we are so familiar with in the labor movement, and I'm not going to elaborate on that, was Canada's representative on this particular United Nations committee and played a critical role in the drafting and the pushing for the UN Resolution 181 that partitioned Palestine in 1947. He did this not out of commitment to a higher cause, not because that was the best solution. We were looking at that time for a binational solution or a one-state solution, but Ivan C. Rand and others pushed for the partition plan out of commitment to the Zionist project. Israel, of course, honored him and honored his superior, in particular Lester B. Pearson, who at that time became the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs. They nicknamed the latter the Balfour of Canada, and they created awards and honorships in the name of Ivan C. Rand to thank him for his service to the creation of the State of Israel. If you review the writings and the speeches of Ivan Rand during this period of time, which are easily accessible at the National Archives of Canada, you will easily see the racist and colonialist ethos and narrative that he espoused when discussing his role on UNSCOP and in the creation of the State of Israel through pushing for the partition resolution, which was not unlike that used to describe the settler colonial project here in Canada to civilize the indigenous people on Turtle Island. In the words of Ivan Rand himself, and I quote, "Because Israel placed such importance on the value of individual freedom, the new state was proving a beacon light in an otherwise darkened section of humanity. Israel was also an anchorage in the Middle East for ethical values and civilizing influence of the West. You can see the Orientalist and colonialist undertones, to say the least, in his thinking and the thinking of Lester B. Pearson, Undersecretary of State. Canada's position on Palestine, of course, over the years, went through ebbs and flows. The Chrétien period probably was one of the most objective, but never really deviated from the American, British, and European position of protecting the State of Israel like one of our own, as Rand said initially. Canada did and does, however, officially oppose Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, and they recognize that there are Palestinian territories that are occupied by Israel, and the settlements are in violation of international law. And a lot of what Israel is doing in the occupied territories is contrary to international law. But Canada does not take any action to stop these violations. And when I mean Canada, I'm talking about the ruling class, I'm talking about the apologists for the state of Israel. I'm not talking about the Canadian people that are increasingly seeing the truth and supporting the Palestinian people's rights to liberation and their human rights. Not only that, but Canada's voting record in the United Nations, in particular over the past couple of decades, with the Harper government and continuing with the Trudeau government, has been decidedly one-sided and has functionally provided full diplomatic cover for Israeli apartheid regime. This includes, of course, the last vote in the United Nations General Assembly last week, when Canada abstained on a resolution calling for a ceasefire. Yes, you heard that right. Canada, the peacekeeping nation, the peacekeeping country, abstained on a call from the international community to stop the carnage and the genocide. This is Canada that we, of course, expected a lot more from. However, it is not surprising, given the fact that Canada as a state and as a ruling elite in Canada have not fully acknowledged or properly confronted its own settler colonial history against the indigenous people on Turtle Island. So it is not surprising. That's why you hear Trudeau and other political leaders in Canada, specifically of certain political parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, talk about the shared values between Canada and Israel. Well, those shared values are the values of settler colonialism. And we need to acknowledge that before we can move forward and dispense with the mess that we've created in Canada. Sadly, as I said, the mask is also off on so-called progressive political parties. The NDP has, unfortunately, although of late called for a ceasefire, they had continued to equate colonizer and the colonized, and in so doing added insult to injury lately, and in particular with the decision of the Ontario NDP that have ejected MVP Sarah Jama, a Muslim Black disability rights activist from caucus, at the same time that she was being censured by the Ford government in the Ontario legislature, specifically for speaking truth to power on Palestine and refusing to toe the party line. What we are witnessing, however, in Canada today is a growing gap between the average Canadians who are seeing Israel for what it really is and supporting Palestinian human rights in their tens of thousands. And they're going to the streets in support of that right. And the ruling class, the media elites, that are doubling down in support of apartheid Israel. When I say apartheid Israel, folks, this is not a terminology that I have created. Okay, apartheid as a designation has been used by international human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem to describe the system that currently exists in the occupied territories in Israel vis-a-vis the indigenous Palestinian people. So in addition to Canada's state support for Israeli apartheid regime, Canada is an increasingly reliable supplier of weapons and arms to Israel that are now being used to commit a genocide in Gaza. Canada has a free trade agreement with Israel. Canada allows the recruitment of foreign soldiers into the Israeli occupation army. And through our tax system, we contribute tax dollars to the campaign of Israeli theft of Palestinian land through the charitable status of the Jewish National Fund. If you'd like to know more about this particular issue, please visit Independent Jewish Voices website that have done a lot of work on this very particular issue. All this to say that Canada has never been a neutral actor on the Palestine question. Angela Davis recently said in an interview, Palestine is the moral litmus test for the world. And on this, Canada's official position has been a dismal failure. What is Labor for Palestine? And what do? It's a network of labor activists across Canada who stand in solidarity with the struggle of the Palestinian workers and Palestinian people. As labor activists, we recognize the important role that unions in particular play in support of justice for Palestinians. We did this in the case of the struggle for justice in South Africa, and we believe that we have an important role to play now in relation justice for Palestinians. Nelson Mandela said, South African freedom is incomplete without freedom of the Palestinian people. And that is what we are doing right now as a labor movement, and what we hope and continue to do going forward. The primary goal of Labor for Palestine is to raise awareness within our movement on the plight of the Palestinian people, to actively support labor unions and workers in Palestine, to educate our members about the history of Palestinian struggle for liberation, to expose the role of the Canadian state and its complicity with Israel's violation of international law, and to build solidarity within our movement for Palestinian human and labor rights. We, of course, if you'd like to get involved in Labor for Palestine, please visit our website as well as any of our social media accounts under Palestine Labor. Unions are political organizations by their very nature. And they engage in political campaigns. That's why we say that this Palestine is a labor issue. We engage in political campaigns, electoral and otherwise. We fight and lobby for better public policy on a whole slew of issues, many of which benefit society as a whole, and not only the specific members of any particular union. Unions, as I said earlier, played an important role in the struggle for South African freedom against the apartheid regime there. We certainly came to supporting the South African struggle a little bit late for two main reasons: because the National African Congress was considered communist and the mainstream media always railed against them, and because Nelson Mandela was also considered a terrorist by mainstream media and the ruling class in Canada. So some people in the labor movement wanted to shy away from their support, as they are doing right now, of the national liberation movement of the Palestinian people. We've come a long way in relation to certainly viewing Nelson Mandela as a hero, and the National African Congress right now being the government in South Africa. Same role and same pressure can be exerted by unions now through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions command that Rana touched on. That campaign is critically important. Currently, we have many national unions, and I'm not going to count them all, that have positions in support of the BDS campaign. Federations of labor, labor councils, unions have adopted that campaign. This is great, and we should encourage other unions to take similar positions. However, this is no longer enough. We need to move beyond support on paper to concrete measures to force our government, the Canadian government, to no longer be complicit and to force Israel to respect international law. We need to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel now. This is the only way we can concretely support the Palestinian struggle right here in Canada. BDS is no different from a workers' picket line, folks, and we always respect picket lines. This is no different, and we should listen to Palestinians as to what they need from their allies, and in this case, we need to be those allies at this critical and pivotal moment. This is what solidarity is all about, and we in the labor movement, we are about solidarity and not charity. Palestinian labor unions and civil society organizations in 2005 issued a BDS call to workers across the globe and to their unions to support their picket line. This is based on non-violent pressure on Israel until it complies with international law. And the three main demands of the BDS movement are ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab land and the dismantling of the apartheid wall, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and three, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. Commitment of unions to decolonization struggle at home and globally, and work for a better world free from oppression and exploitation necessitate that if we are to remain consistent, we need to support the Palestinian people's decolonization struggle through adopting BDS position and acting on them. Folks, there's a lot we can do at this point. There is a genocide that's happening, that unfolding before our eyes. And as Rana said, this genocide and the ethnic cleansing and the Nakba, the catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people, is not new. It's been ongoing for 75 years. Of course, we have immediate tasks before us. So attending rallies and demonstrations is critically important, and we need to bring more people because those are calling for a ceasefire. They are calling for an immediate end to the siege on Gaza and the halting of the killings of civilians. We need to speak up and speak out, to contact your elected union leadership, those that haven't spoken out. Ask them to take a principled position, and also ask them to take a position in support of BDS and act on it. Contact your local MPP, MP, municipal politician, and ask them to speak up themselves for Palestinian human rights and to support the call for a ceasefire now. On the mid to longer term, we need to establish, you can establish Labor for Palestine committees in your union, local or labor council in your city. If your organization does not have a position in support of BDS, have them take a position in support of the BDS. If your union or local or labor council has a position in support of BDS, work with others in your organization to act on those resolutions. Start with organizations with organizing around the procurement policy, and move to looking at your pension plan and make sure to divest from any companies that benefit from the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Of course, contact us, contact independent Jewish voices, contact Labor Against the Arms Trade, and work with us to create apartheid-free zones in your workplaces, in your communities, in your universities, whatever the case may be. Speaking out, of course, joining a demo, writing a letter, and multiple other forms of actions are forms of resistance, and most importantly, right here in Canada, there are forms of solidarity against apartheid and against settler colonialism, against occupation, and against the genocide. So never stop resisting, never stop standing in solidarity with oppressed people, because the children of Gaza will never forgive us if we do. Apartheid Israel's brutality that we are witnessing right now in Gaza and in the West Bank, and there's a lot happening in the West Bank. This brutality and the genocidal actions is not a sign of strength, it's a sign of weakness. Despite all this carnage and the brutality that we are seeing, I have never been more positive that Palestine will be free during my lifetime. Thank you. Free Palestine.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you for your presentation and for explaining the, Canada's role in all this, the role that the labor movement can play. And I want to add, you mentioned call on your elected representatives, your MPs, MPPs, municipal electeds. But I want to add to that, call on your union leaders, for those who are members of unions, and have these discussions in your union. Because struggles for justice always have to start from the grassroots. That's where we build from. So thank you, Hassan, and thank you to everyone with Labor for Palestine for all the organizing work that you're doing. Okay, so it's now my privilege to introduce our next guest speaker, Judy Rebick from Independent Jewish Voices. Judy is one of Canada's most renowned feminists. Very lucky to have you joining us tonight, Judy. She's the former president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, and was a spokesperson for the pro-choice campaign that won legal abortion in Canada in the 1980s. She is a longtime friend and ally to the Labour movement, and has served on the Ontario Federation of Labour's Women's Committee. She is the author of 6 books. Her latest, a memoir, Heroes in My Head, is a story of healing from trauma and activism. I'm going to be picking up a copy of that memoir after this webinar, and it is my privilege to invite Judy to take the mic. Judy.
Thank you very much, Alex. And Hassan, it's good to see you again. Someone in the Q&A said, why didn't you invite a Jew on this panel? So I'm going to say, I'm a Jew, okay? Born and raised. In fact, my first political fight was to have a bar mitzvah. When in those days we called it a bar mitzvah because girls weren't allowed to have bar mitzvahs. Now they call them bat mitzvahs. And I didn't see why I, who was going to Hebrew school, shouldn't be able to have a bar mitzvah like my brother. So I am definitely Jewish, but I am different than most Jews in that I do not think Israel has been good for Jewish people at all. I didn't start I thought that I started thinking that way in 1970. Okay. I went to Israel. I was a hippie, right? So I wasn't that into Israel or anything else. But I went to Israel and I was really shocked by what I saw, because I saw the racism against what they called then, oh, they still do, called Arabs. I didn't know the word Palestinian then. And I was really horrified by it. And as a result, when I came home, I studied and I saw that the idea of Israel, what we call Zionism, is that the Judaism is not just a religion, but the Jewish people are a nationality and should have their own country. And I didn't agree with that then. Now it's happened, so we have to have a different kind of solution. But I believe in democracy. I don't believe in a Jewish state or a Muslim state or a Christian state. I mean, I'm a Jew. If Canada was a Christian state and I didn't have equal rights to Protestants, I'd be fighting that. So would we all, right? And that is the case both inside Israel and definitely in the occupied territories. But there's a lot of I don't know, I guess I can say bullshit here, right? There's a lot of bullshit about this. And one of the things that's really ramping up is this idea that if you're critical of Israel, you're anti-Semitic. Now, it's certainly true that some people who are critical of Israel are anti-Semitic. I've certainly experienced it. But it's not an equation between the Jewish people and Israel. Unfortunately, up until now, it's been a very tiny minority of Jewish people speaking out. In 2009, I was one of 8 Jewish women who occupied the Israeli consulate to protest that at that time an attack against Gaza, and there was really a small number of people that were actively protesting, Jewish people, I'm saying. Most of them were pretty lefty, right? But that's changing. We had a demonstration in Toronto of Jews for the ceasefire, Jews Against Genocide, last week, where 500 people showed up. And I was moved to tears. Like I've never been moved to tears by a protest in my life. But I see what's happening is that more and more Jewish people, and in the States, it's been incredible. I think I'm terrible remembering names, but Jewish Voices for Peace, I think they're called. They organized 500 people, occupied Congress, got arrested for protesting and demanding a ceasefire. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people marched through the streets of New York, Jews, the streets of New York and Brooklyn, to demand a ceasefire. And so I feel that, and so that, and the massive number of people protesting. Like I spoke at the rally a couple of weeks ago, the first big rally, and I don't know how many people were there, but I mean, it was the biggest rally I remember since the pro-choice days. And I'm going to come back to pro-choice. Since the pro-choice days, at least 5,000, 6,000 people in Toronto. We haven't seen that in Toronto in a long, long time. And in the States, the protests have been huge, and all around the world, even in Seoul, Korea, everywhere, people are rising up in support of Palestine and support of Gaza and in support of a ceasefire. So that's where I think I really like to discuss more, Hassan, how you're optimistic in this situation. I'm finding that a little difficult, but I see a rise of a new peace movement. That's what I'm seeing all over the world. And it's that I find very heartening. But there's not a lot of union flags in these demonstrations. Like I go to a lot of demonstrations, and in the climate marches now, there's union flags. In the Indigenous solidarity marches, there's union flags. I haven't seen much in this, so that's why I'm really glad that you're having these webinars to talk about the importance of the labor movement speaking out on Palestine. And I want to go back to the pro-choice movement, because back in the day, in 1982, there was an Ontario Federation of Labor Convention. Maybe there's somebody on this call besides me that remembers it. And we had opened, Dr. Morgenthaler had opened an illegal abortion clinic in Toronto. And the NDP at the time, under the leadership of Bob Rae, who's not exactly our favorite person at the moment, he refused to support the Morgenthaler clinic because it was illegal. He said, we have to support the rule of law, you know? And so we went to the OFL, and it was really a lot of women organized. Like, we lined up at the mics and we demanded that the Ontario Federation of Labor support the clinic. And of course, there were anti-choice people there, but they knew they didn't have a majority in the labor movement for their position. So they would argue, well, this is not a labor issue and it's very divisive, and we'll be really upset, you know, as Catholics or whatever other reason that they're against choice. And Cliff Pilkey, who was a president of the OFL, came down from the mic onto the floor, and he said, this labor movement is half women, and abortion is an issue for women, and therefore it's our issue. And we won the OFL supporting the Morgenthaler Clinic when it was illegal. Remember, it was illegal, right? And that, to me, that was a turning point in our struggle, because it allowed us, the labor came and helped us to defend the clinics when there was violence, and all kinds of other things. It was a big turning point. And so I think the visibility, just like the visibility of Jews now in the struggle, is really important, because it makes it much harder to argue that it's anti-Semitic to oppose Israel. It's really important for labor, not only because of the social and political power of labor, but also for seeing, for the Palestinians and Muslims and Arabs on those marches, to see the labor movement there. It means everything. Like, I know when I spoke on behalf of Independent Jewish Voices at that rally, I've never had the experience of people coming to me with tears in their eyes to thank me for speaking, because Palestinian people feel very isolated because of all the propaganda, if you want, about them being anti-Semitic. I can tell you, I have been to Palestine, I have been to Gaza, and I never ran into anti-Semitism any more than I do in Toronto. They're not anti-Semitic. They're mad at Israel. They're not mad at the Jews. Hamas, yes. Hamas is anti-Semitic, okay? Hamas wants to kill all the Jews. I'm horrified by what Hamas did. But, you know, I was in Israel in 2009, and I met with, in Palestine, I met with Jewish feminists to discuss with them how to defeat Hamas so they wouldn't win the election, okay? Israel didn't help with that. Israel didn't help the nonviolent Palestinian movement. In fact, BDS was what the nonviolent Palestinian movement proposed. And if you organize BDS, you're called an anti-Semite, right? So I think weaponizing anti-Semitism actually puts Jews more at risk, not less at risk, by saying that, you know, anybody who disagrees with Israel is an anti-Semite, and equating Israel and Judaism. It's not an equation. You know, there was a huge debate among Jews in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the 21st century about Zionism. Zionism does not equate with Zionism being believing in a Jewish state. Zionism does not equate with Judaism any more than you know, every Muslim agrees with an Islamic state. And so I think we have to stand up to that. Those charges of anti-Semitism, they're not true. You know, Israel has a very effective lobbying machine in Canada, very effective, and they're on everybody who speaks out. And we have to stand up to that. And I think that the reason that we have not debates on this, but actually have Palestinian people speaking to us, is because it's the only way we can hear directly from them, because we're not hearing enough from them in the media. And I'll end on this, is that one of the really good points I've heard in the discussion and listening to media, Democracy Now! Actually is a really good source of information on this, is that we hear the stories we hear the stories of Jews who were killed, Israelis who were killed by Hamas, and we hear their individual stories, but we're not hearing the individual stories of the Palestinians who are being killed. We're not hearing the individual stories of Palestinians who have lost their whole families in this struggle and previous struggle, lost their homes, lost their everything, and continue to struggle. So I feel, I don't know if anyone else of my generation feels it, but it feels a lot like the uprising against the Vietnam War, and also inspired by the bravery of the people. Like, I think part of what inspired the youth movement to support the people of Vietnam against the United States was the bravery of the Vietnamese people. And I think we see that in like in among the Palestinian people, incredible resilience and bravery in the face of terrible, terrible violence. And so I think that it's really, really important for the labor movement to be visible on this, to be part of those demonstrations, and to be speaking out as you are. So thank you very much for hosting this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judy. Really an honor to have you joining us. Very grateful you took the time. And thank you for your presentation and for so clearly and thoroughly making that case, that distinction, right, between the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Such an important thing to keep in mind as we discuss something that is difficult to discuss for a lot of folks, but it's important to be objective about it. So thank you so much. One thing I want to quickly point out before we go to our final panelist, we're seeing a lot of questions in being submitted to the Q&A. Thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone again that we're going to be getting to these after our last panelist speaks. We're not going to be answering the questions in the Q&A, but they're going to be sent to me, and I'll be asking them out to the panelists. So with that, as our final panelist, I'd like to introduce Wasim Garzouzi, who will touch on the rights of workers in the workplace. Wasim is a lawyer who maintains a robust national practice dedicated exclusively to the representation of unions and of workers, with a particular focus on arbitration. Wasim and I actually first met back in 2019 when he represented my home local in a few grievances we had going to arbitration, where at the time I was local vice president. In addition to litigating, Wasim bargains on behalf of trade unions in the provincial and federal sectors. He is the past president of the Canadian Association of Labour Lawyers and currently sits on the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association's board of directors. He's also a part-time professor at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law, teaching the advanced labor law course in both French and English. In the same role, Wasim led a successful organizing drive, resulting in the unionization of hundreds of faculty members at the University of Ottawa. And he also teaches collective agreements arbitration at Queen's University. Wasim is the co-author of Winning Cases at Grievance Arbitration. I guess that's another book I'm going to have to pick up. The leading book on the law and practice pertaining to labor arbitration advocacy. Outside of labor, Wasim has no interest or hobbies. He is singularly focused on serving his clients. And that just might be my favorite line to end a biography with. Wasim, my friend, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. I wanted to maybe just start by relaying a story that I encountered when I was in law school. I attended a panel, and this is probably 10, 15 years ago. And the panel was a group of lawyers from North Africa and the Middle East. And one of the questions was, how do you talk about Israel, Palestine at the workplace? And I'll always remember that one of the speakers said, don't, and he left it at that. And he was dead serious, and the room just kind of turned stone cold. And it really set the tone for what took place, I think, for the next 15 years up until today, where I was in a hearing today, and I was speaking with opposing counsel, and I was speaking with the decision maker, and I was explaining that I'll be speaking on a panel today talking about rights of employees to, freedom of expression and what the limitations are. And I said, what advice would you give? And I'm speaking again to two lawyers. And both of them said, my advice would be don't. And I think it's that really backdrop, right? That backdrop that's been ongoing and constant for most of my professional life that I wanted to kind of relay, because a lot of people, especially government workers, are familiar with rights such as the freedom of expression or rights such as the freedom of association. And when you hear those rights on paper and they're protected by the charter, then you generally feel like these are extremely powerful rights. And, anyone in Ottawa in January, February 2022 heard the word freedom a lot, which, for some people extended to just occupying city blocks and just making a tremendous amount of noise in front of your house. And so what I wanted to kind of focus this presentation on really is what limitations exist to the freedom of expression, right? Because I think that's the question that I routinely get. And just in the last 2 weeks, I can relay that I've dealt with university professors who've been removed from the classroom pending investigations due to the discussions about the current conflict. I've spoken with assistants working in private medical offices, again, terminated. They were not unionized, they weren't government workers, but terminated. I've spoken to pilots, one in particular who was removed from the workplace due to social media posts outside of the workplace. But also journalists and lawyers who've also encountered a lot of adverse treatment as a result of their expression on this issue. And so I want to focus this presentation on mostly PSAC members, right? Federal public sector employees who are generally unionized. And I want to really focus that on what kind of rights exist and what limitations are in place. And so maybe the starting point, because this is, most people are familiar with it, is what is, the freedom of expression. And just like all rights, and, this is going to be a frustrating answer for everyone listening here, right? It really is subject to certain limitations. And then people are going to say, well, what are those limitations? And it's, whatever is reasonable, right? Reasonable limitations. And what does reasonable mean? Well, it means it depends on the specific circumstances of the case. So that's not super helpful, and I'll grant you that. But what's ironic is government workers feel like, well, we have more protections in ways that non-unionized employees may not. And we have charter protections, which non-government workers do not have. But the flip side to those rights are principles that you've most certainly heard at some point throughout your employment, which is the general duty of loyalty. And the general duty of loyalty that exists for federal public sector workers is not a new concept, right? And it's actually a concept that has been defined and debated in courts and in board decisions since the 80s. And one of the early cases, and I think it shows you how these controversies are different, but somehow end up dovetailing, was a case that happened in Kingston in the early 80s. And it's the case of Neil Fraser. And anyone here who's got any type of interest on limitations to the freedom of expression should really look this case up. And Neil Fraser worked for Revenue Canada, and he had nothing to do with the metric system whatsoever or the imperial system. But for whatever reason, he really took offense to Canada transitioning away from the imperial system towards the metric system, to the point where he would write op-eds to local newspapers. He would hold signs at city council meetings, at other public forums. He would hold signs that would say, "Your freedom to measure is a measure of your freedom." And he was repeatedly reprimanded. He got a suspension, a lengthier suspension. Ultimately, he was terminated. And he argued for the right as a Canadian citizen to his freedom of expression, which shouldn't be limited solely on the fact that he is an employee of the federal government. And in a very bittersweet outcome for him, the court generally agreed that it is not because you are a federal public sector employee, you lose your rights to freedom of expression. However, in his case, in his circumstances, maybe he went overboard by showing up at all these protests and being such a public figure about this issue. And ultimately, all the way to the Supreme Court, his termination was upheld. But three principles that I kind of wanted to flag was that it is recognized, and everyone will say this, is that, in a democratic society, public debate is important. And no one will dispute that. Now, obviously, when you're discussing this particular issue, people will say, well, that crossed the line or that went too far. But there's a general understanding that public debate is part of a free and democratic society. The second one is that government employees started off as a relatively small group of people in the 50s and 60s, and now it's a tremendously large group. So imposing a blanket ban on political expression generally would really deny fundamental democratic rights to a huge part of our society, and that doesn't make sense. Which leads to the kind of third factor, which is common sense. Now, again, reasonable, common sense, this is all kind of fluid and ambiguous, and I understand that, and I understand how challenging it is for employees to navigate those waters, which is why I want to kind of talk about the different factors that are going to be looked at to determine whether or not the speech that you're communicating is reasonable, or what factors will be ultimately looked at. Now, the first point that I just want to make is that there is a distinction, obviously, if you're communicating at the workplace and you've got signs up and you're telling your colleagues, how they should be, thinking and so on. That might be treated differently than if you're a public speaker at a protest, or alternatively, if you've got a private Facebook page, or alternatively, whether it's a public Facebook page. But I want to still emphasize the point that once your actions enter the workplace, right, the employer can use that as a justification to impose disciplinary action. So by way of example, if you post something on your Facebook page that a colleague sees and says that message was hateful, or that message was otherwise inconsistent with your role as a employee, then the employer may look into it and investigate and move forward. So those are the kind of factors I want to talk about. So they're kind of obvious, but what I want everyone participating on this panel tonight to kind of consider is, how does that affect me? So the first one is the nature of your work. So if you work for Global Affairs Canada and you're taking positions on a foreign issue that is a foreign affairs issue that is, critical of the position of Global Affairs Canada, or if you're taking a position that is adversely oppositional to the position that you're working on, for example, then that in and of itself could constitute a breach to the duty of loyalty. And one example of that is a 2013 decision from the federal board, which was an employee who worked to deal with Indigenous land claims, and who participated in protests against the Olympics on the basis that the Olympics were on stolen Aboriginal land. And that was deemed by the board to be incompatible or inconsistent with the duties of that employee. So what department do you work for, and what's your role? So are you a public-facing employee, or are you an employee who publicly represents the government or an organization? Then in those circumstances, your restrictions on your speech are going to be greater than if you're not public facing and if you're not working in one of those departments. If you're a manager and you're exercising any type of authority over other employees, then there too, that will limit your expression rights. And then if you've got, a photo of yourself with your government ID in a photo, and a sign or a banner or a message that you're communicating, and you're identifying yourself as an employee, then in those circumstances, the consequences are going to be more severe. Now, other considerations to consider: are there policies? Are there messages that have been sent out telling employees not to participate in these types of protests? And again, on that issue, what I just want to emphasize is, those will be factors that will be considered. Other factors to consider: what's your role in a protest? Are you organizing the protest? Are you speaking at the protest? Or are you just participating in a protest? Are you taking signs with people? Are the signs that you're carrying accurate information? All of those factors will also play a role. And one thing that I just want to kind of emphasize that most people will be relatively familiar with is that the employer can take action, and that's subject to your right to grievances if you're unionized. And so in those circumstances, what I just want to emphasize here too is that you have to be mindful that the employer may take unjustified action, or maybe it may be justified, but ultimately that's a process that you really have to engage And so that's why you want to consider these factors beforehand and not maybe after the fact. But these are all kind of factors that will be balanced by an ultimate decision maker. And then finally, I just want to talk quickly, because oftentimes we'll hear about, the Canadian Human Rights Act. And one factor that I just wanted to say is that in some jurisdictions, different jurisdictions have different human rights statutes. In some jurisdictions, for example, in Quebec or otherwise, political expression will be protected. It'll be protected grounds in terms of your human rights. Under the Canadian Human Rights Act, political expression is not one of the protected grounds. However, in some circumstances, one of the cases that I'm dealing with right now, there's a Palestinian woman who tweeted about different things that are happening. Tweeted about one of the bombings, and one of her colleagues took a screenshot of that, sent it to the employer, and the employer terminated her, saying that they didn't feel safe around her, and that coded language really based on that you can kind of get from race or her ethnicity or her religion even. And so you can tie it, but again, political expression is not a separate ground under the Canadian Human Rights Act. So ultimately the message that I'm just trying to convey in all of this is that as employees of the federal public service, you do have rights. You have charter rights, which does protect the freedom of expression, the freedom of association. But as always, those rights come with limits. And so be aware of those, think about these issues, and always involve your union whenever, or you anticipate, or whenever there is an issue.
Thank you so much, Wasim. Thank you so much for that comprehensive explanation of the rights that workers have in the federal public service. Very useful information to have. And I just want to echo your final point there. Contact your union. If you are disciplined in any way for posting personally about your own views, contact your union. There is assistance available there. You have a right to have a union rep present if you're brought into any disciplinary hearing. It is your right to have a union rep present with you. And if you're experiencing any discrimination or harassment, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, any form of discrimination or racism, please get in touch with your union. Thank you to all our panelists. So we have just about 10 minutes left. We're going to try to fit in as many questions as we can. Thank you, everyone. So again, questions have been submitted through the Q&A. So I'm going to read some of these out. I'm going to start with, all right. So a question for Labor for Palestine. So I'll throw this one to Hassan, and I'll invite all the panelists if you'd like to come back on camera for the Q&A. This first question will go to you, Hassan. I'm a new steward. I've been trying to get my union to release a statement, but they are choosing to remain silent and are not interested in activism. I'm not connected to the broader labor movement, and I'm unsure if that even exists in my city. How do I find other workers in my city who also refuse to remain silent?
Well, one way of doing it, thank you for the question, is to get in touch with us at Labor for Palestine. We have activists right across the country in different unions, in different sectors. And we can put you in touch with activists in your city, perhaps in your own union or other union that are working on Palestine solidarity. That I think would be the easiest way to go about it, as opposed to you putting an ad somewhere and saying, all those activists in my vicinity, please call me because I'd like to do something. Get in touch with us through any of the means to reach us on social media at Palestine Labor. And we will be more than happy to connect you to other activists.
Thank you, Hassan. So for this next question, this might be one that you'd like to speak on as well, Hassan, but I'll go to Judy first. So, I do want to say I recognize the person who submitted this question. It's somebody who I've been exchanging emails with over the last couple of days, and I just want to say I'm very grateful that you chose to be here tonight. And I hope the intent of this initiative and this work, I hope that's been made clear throughout the webinar. So the question, and I'll start with Judy, what is the solution? What does it mean to free Palestine? What would happen to Israelis and to Palestinians living there? Oh, you're on mute, Judy.
I don't think it's up to us to say what the solution is. That's number one. It's up to the people living in that land. And that includes Israelis and Palestinians, right? Like I said, I didn't agree with a Jewish state, but now it exists and people are living there. You know, say, I don't agree with Canada either, right? That people came here from Europe and settled and slaughtered Indians and settled. I didn't agree with that either, but now we're here. I don't think we're going to go anywhere. And I don't think the Israelis are going to go anywhere. So I don't think, you know, I think this, you know, drive the Israelis into the sea stuff is just rhetoric. You know, that's not going to happen. And I don't think it's up to us to say what is going to happen. I think it's up to the people on that land to say what's going to happen. But one thing I know is that violence is not going to solve it. Violence is not going to solve it. And this thing about Israel as a right to defend itself is just bullshit, because Israel is the occupying force. It's not like they're going up against an independent country and it's a war. It's not a war. And you know, so this idea that Israel has a right to defend itself is just a wrong-headed idea. It's terrible what happened to the Israelis in southern Israel. It's terrible. But the answer to that is not to slaughter thousands and thousands of Palestinians. That's just going to blow up the whole Middle East. And so you know, I don't think it's up to us to answer that question. And I don't think we have to answer the question. Our job now is to get our government to take a position for a ceasefire and to get that border open so that humanitarian aid can come in. That is our job right now. And that is an urgent job. And we can discuss, you know, another time, different solutions, not today.
Thank you, Judy. Very well said. Hassan, did you want to add to that?
Just briefly, I do want to reiterate what Judy said. The most immediate task right now is to call for a ceasefire, which our government, the Canadian government, is refusing to do. End the carnage at this immediate moment in time. As labor activist and as trade unionist, I said in my remarks that we are answering the call of the Palestinian people for a global picket line through support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions like we did in South Africa. That is what they're asking us for. That is, you know, without, you know, attempting to provide an answer, there are lists of demands there that I spoke about in my remarks as well. That is a beginning of a solution in that respect, and that is what the people in the region, the oppressed Palestinian people who have been living under an occupation for 75 years have asked us to do in the name of solidarity. But I do want to reiterate that ultimately the solution will have to come from the region, not from us. We can be in solidarity, but we cannot provide the solution from here.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Judy.
Switch into French. This question was asked in French. I'm going to answer it because I think, will the Alliance apply pressure on the Canadian government to obtain a ceasefire? The answer is the PSAC continues to and is a signatory to the ceasefirenow.ca, calling on the government to demand an immediate ceasefire. There are religious groups, community groups, progressive groups, humanitarian groups, as well as other labor players. I can't speak on behalf of the PSAC, but I can speak for the NCR that here in the National Capital Region, the PSAC will continue to support calls for a ceasefire to support peaceful efforts and humanitarian intervention.
Switching back to English here, I'm going to throw this one to you, Wasim. Wasim, if you want to come back on camera. Hey, this is, I think this was covered in your presentation, but maybe if you just want to expand on it, or if you have anything else to add. The question is, aren't we public employees not supposed to express political views?
Yeah, so it's been expressly held that you are entitled, you're still citizens, and it's still part of the democratic fabric of the country to have citizens express their viewpoints, right? The consideration that you always have to weigh against that is you have a heightened responsibility to be aware of your responsibilities, your functions, what department you work for. Is it incompatible, right? Do you deal with the public? Do you not deal with the public? And there's no perfect answer to this. I know that the PSC has a tool that you could click on and you could try out to see whether or not the speech that you're considering falls within the range of acceptable speech. I know PSAC is critical of that tool. There are decisions from the Supreme Court and from the Public Sector Labor Relations Board where that the freedom of expression is confirmed. But you should just be aware that there are restrictions to it, but that your right is still there, right? And everyone recognizes it. It's just a question of, to what extent is it compatible with your functions? To what extent is it incompatible with your functions? So unfortunately, it'll be case by case. There's no answer that I can give except to say that your right to speech is recognized and is part of a robust democratic society to have people being able to express their views subject to those limitations I've talked about already.
Thank you, Wasim. And I'll stick with you for this next one. I'm going to try to fit in two more. The last one's going to be about organizing, so I'll save that one for last. But another one for you, Wasim. What if all your posts are strictly about the ceasefire and the genocide and not tied to the government of Canada's stance? And the person also asked, is wearing a keffiyeh work an issue? Or is it okay until someone complains?
Right. So ultimately, I'll say a couple of things, right? You don't have a right not to be investigated. Let's just put it that way, right? So if someone does complain, then that could trigger an investigation. That could trigger for you a process that you wish, is not happening. So that's why, what I would just kind of start by saying is you should be aware of that before making those decisions. And you should be in a position to be able to defend those positions, right? You should be aware of what it is you're expressing. Now, the examples that you've given, for example, showing up with a keffiyeh to work, I hate to repeat myself, but really it would depend. I would say that you're just wearing a scarf, and you're appearing at the workplace with the wear that you want to wear. But if there's a complaint and someone asks you about it, then you should just be prepared to answer what that is, and why you're wearing it. What I'll say is that the employer will generally communicate more restrictions than actually exist, and the general public will generally think that there are fewer restrictions than actually exist, right? So when you look at the PSC tool, for example, that I just mentioned, that's a very restrictive tool, right? And it's being applied in such a manner so that people limit their expression. Now, as I said earlier, PSAC is critical of that. I would encourage everyone to look at the PSAC resources on expression, and they link to decisions, and consider your individual circumstances. But when you're communicating for peace, if it's not, again, if it's a general position versus a specific one, if you don't work for global affairs, if you're not public facing, if you're not a manager, then all those factors would militate in favor of your freedom of expression. But you should just be aware that the employer will generally say there are more restrictions on your freedom of expression, and the general public who's protesting and who sees that there's a charter will generally think that your freedom of expression may be broader than it actually is.
Thanks, Wasim. And for any gray areas, contact your union. and your union's there to support you. So it's 8:32, but with everyone's indulgence, I'm going to throw one final question. I'll throw this one to Hassan, and then I'll invite all the panelists to give closing remarks. So for this last question, I said it was going to be about organizing. How can unions organize around Palestinian solidarity? I want my local or union to support BDS or make a statement. Other union members are also concerned but nervous to challenge the dominant power structure. How can I encourage them to have this conversation? What tactics and approaches can help get some movement?
That is a very important question. I think the most important element to answer this question is for people to come together. There is always strength in numbers. We always say that in the labor movement. So don't go it alone. Don't try to be a hero about it. Contact some of those people that have the same viewpoint as you. And if they're calling and they're pushing for a ceasefire, for instance, or the end of the genocide, or they want to take a position in support of BDS, bring them together and approach your local leadership, whether it's at the local level, at the provincial level, at the labor council, whatever the case may be. Work as a group, as a collective. There are a lot of resources out there that you can use. They're at your fingertips, essentially. They're available for you to support you to engage with other members who may not have the same knowledge as you or may not be at the same level as you in terms of Palestine solidarity. Go to our website. We have speakers that we can provide. We have workshops, educationals on Palestine solidarity. Get in touch. Don't do it by yourself. And also recognize that the labor movement, I've been around the labor movement and the student movement and organizations of this nature for about 30 years or more. And I can tell you there's a huge sea change in terms of Palestine solidarity right across organizations and specifically within the student and the labor movement. Despite all the fear-mongering, despite all the efforts to shut us down, we are in fact making a great improvements to the atmosphere and to the organizing efforts that have been undertaken right across the board within the labor movement. Use that to support your efforts at the local level to bring people together. Once again, get in touch with us, get in touch with Independent Jewish Voices. There are resources there to support you in organizing your co-workers.
Thank you very much, Hassan. So we'll now move to closing remarks, and I'll start with Judy. Oh, you're on mute again, sister.
Used to being online this late. I know it's not late, but for me it's late. Yeah, I guess what I want to say is that I'm seeing a real uprising happening, that I haven't seen in a long time. We saw the Black Lives Matter marches, and they were an uprising, but it was primarily the Black community with allies, right? This is way broader than that. Like I was at the march on Saturday. I think it was on last Saturday in Toronto. And it was the most diverse group I've ever seen, age-wise, race-wise, every way. And I think that finally the plight of the Palestinian people, which has been marginalized for so long, which has been, they're breaking out of that. It's breaking out. Now, I understand now, I guess, Hassan's remarks. And it's so important. Like at first, I'm 78 years old, right? And at first, at the first moment when I heard about the massacre, which was terrible, but I knew what was coming. I knew this kind of attack would come from Israel. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. I just can't, because I'm very visible, right? And I can't do it anymore. I can't do it. I don't have the energy for it. And it's true, I don't have the energy for it, but I'm doing it because I think it's the fight of our lives. I think that if if the West, if the US and Canada and the other Western countries can get away with supporting this kind of massacre, this kind of genocide, because it's Israel, because of, you know, the way that because it's Israel and because it's their interest in the Middle East, which is the real reason they support Israel. Things are gonna be way worse for all of us if that is allowed to happen. So we can't let it happen. We can't let it happen. And I think people feel that. And the feeling of being in these marches is really wonderful. That's the other thing I want to end with. We had a teach-in for Gaza at TMU, formerly Ryerson, and it was one of the most beautiful meetings I've ever been at. It was like a love-in, you know, because and there was Palestinian food served, and I'm just going to end on this. And a young man who was helping to serve the food, he was in the elevator with me on the way down, and he said, I want to thank you because as a Palestinian, I feel so alone, and I feel like we have support here. And I want to thank you for that. And it just meant so much, you know, to know that a people who have been so brutalized for so long and isolated and vilified, that finally the people of the world are rising up in solidarity. And that's a beautiful thing. So thank you. And please try and find a way to support the ceasefire and the opening up of Gaza to humanitarian aid. Thank you.
Powerfully said, Judy. Thank you so much. I'm gonna, before I go to Wasim next for closing remarks, I just want to mention that Rena, who was joining us earlier, of course, had to jump off the call because it's about 3 a.m. in Palestine. So, you know, she went and got some rest. Wasim, closing remarks.
One last factor that I would just say is that political action or expression through your union provides or is provided with more protections than individual speech. And so when I see a lot of questions from people saying, you know, what about, you know, this issue, or how can I get this done? What I would just encourage people to do is to work through their union, to work with colleagues and through collective action, because political speech does come with its own protections that are recognized by courts and protected through the charter as well. So that's really the last message that I want to emphasize, is to work through your union as well and with your colleagues.
Thank you so much for that, Wasim, and thanks again for joining us. Hassan, brother, final word of the night is yours.
I want to send a message to labor activists here that you do have the right to be protected for engaging in political action and engaging in free speech. And that protection comes from the laws, but also your membership in a union if you have a union. Use it. There is no better time to stand up and be counted than now. I also want to say that laws are not always, all the laws are just. And laws change and laws have improved because we pushed the envelope. Judy spoke about some of them. And the change to the law comes as a result of people challenging the powers that be. If there is any time we need to challenge the power that be, if there is any time we need to speak truth to power, if there is any time we need to take a stand against injustice and against the genocide and against the oppression and the subjugation of the Palestinian people, it is now. Use it, come together in collectives, challenge, stand up, take a principled position, a moral position, and let us together defend that right and defend the Palestinian people's right to their human rights, to their civil rights, to their political rights, and to the right to be free. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you, brother. Well, before we end, I do want to share with all participants that we are going to be sending a follow-up email. There was a lot of questions, a lot of great questions about, wanting more information on resources that were mentioned. So we are going to be sending a follow-up email with resources, links to groups and websites, as well as a YouTube link with a recording of this webinar that you can then share. I'm probably not going to get to that tonight because everybody's been working hard and it is getting late. But we will send that follow-up email sometime tomorrow or shortly in the coming days. Also want to announce that there is a National Day of Action, November 4th. There's going to be actions across Canada. Here in Ottawa, there's going to be a rally at 2 p.m. at Parliament Hill. There's also a climate rally starting at 1 p.m., which is then going to merge into to joining the Palestine rally at 2 p.m. So encourage you to join us on Parliament Hill. This Saturday, November 4th. Also, November 12th, there's going to be another National Day of Action organized by the Ceasefire Now Coalition. So more information on that will be posted online soon, and I encourage you to participate in that. And with that, I just want to, again, thank everyone. Thank all of our panelists for joining us. Thank everybody supporting on the back end, the technicians, the team at ELC. Once again, I want to thank all of you for joining this, for engaging on this issue. And I want to say to everyone, please stay safe and take good care of yourselves. Solidarity. Thanks, everybody. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.